What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more Dead Kennedys, and we're going to listen to one of the only tunes from their 1982 album Plastic Surgery Disasters I've yet to react to, which, as you can see, I have both the LP for and the original Alternative Tentacles version of the album, which I've talked about it in a number of reactions, so I won't spend too much time, but eventually Alternative Tentacles, which is Jello Biafra's independent punk label, lost the rights to the Dead Kennedys catalog because of the way the court dispute between Jello and the other members of the band in terms of the rights to the music played out, and it has since been on Manifesto, which is a label I think set up by the other guys to distribute it. But yes, I'm very happy that I have all their albums in CD form on the original Alternative Tentacles label, which is also the label that I have for the record here. In any case, we're going to listen to Bleed For Me, which is a dark and intense tune lyrically, but dare I say, as relevant now as it was then, probably more so. Which is to say, this song is about authoritarian repressive regimes, both abroad and more specifically in South America, but also in the United States, and in two respects in relation to the United States, meaning the way that back in the 80s, especially under the Reagan presidency, the US used their influence both publicly and behind the scenes with CIA ops and so on to support right-wing dictatorships in Latin America, and in other cases used their influence to prop up right-wing resistance, like paramilitary groups in countries with more left-leaning governments. And specifically, this song speaks to El Salvador, which, like now, back then had a right-wing repressive government that would jail dissidents, disappear people, hold them incommunicado without a trial, and ultimately disappear them in the fatal and permanent sense. And without going too much into modern day politics, El Salvador literally is in the process of giving their right-wing populist president an unprecedented constitutional exception, meaning it was in their constitution that he wasn't supposed to run for multiple terms, and now he can run unopposed for an indefinite number of terms. In any case, it's also about the way in which here in the US, the government oftentimes uses flimsy pretenses to arrest dissidents, to put them in jail, to prevent them from organizing peacefully and publicly. And again, in 2025, when unmarked vehicles and officers with no identifying badges are throwing people into the back of vans, both immigrants and U.S. citizens alike, and holding them, transporting them to other states, and trying to deport them before, anyone can say anything about it or have a proper trial, it feels especially relevant. So, yeah, the song makes reference to some specific aspects of the 80s and the U.S. propping up the far-right El Salvadoran government, particularly a reference to the assassination of Archbishop Romero, but also the brutal murders of 4 U.S. female missionaries, Catholic nun missionaries, that was essentially ordered by the highest levels of the El Salvadoran government, and which was only pressured by the United States to investigate it once it became this big issue here in the news and so on. And even then, once Reagan got into power, he essentially said, we're going to keep supporting them, giving them arms, and so on. So, yeah, it's a song about right-wing dictatorships, disappearing people, torturing them to, get information to then take down their movements, or anyone who's organizing in resistance to the totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. And in the song, it's more about what the U.S. is doing down in Latin America, but also what they'd like to do here. And as I said, I think in the present day, it's at least as relevant in both cases, if not more so in the case here in the U.S. domestically. Enough pontificating, let's listen to it. This is Dead Kennedys, the tune is Bleed For Me, and if I can read which side this is on, is it this side? I think it is. Yes, okay. So, as I said, Dead Kennedys, Bleed For Me, from Plastic Surgery Disasters, 1982.
What? Tonight it's a blast.
Of world peace, in the name of world profits, America puts up our secret police. America wants pure. To get it, it needs puppets. So what's the million dead if it's keeping out the Russians? Well, trained by the CIA with taking tax money and pork brag. The Peace Corps builds like the labor camps when they think they're building school. Cowboy Ronnie comes to town, forks out his tongue at human rights. Sit down and enjoy our ethnic meal. Dine on some charred brilliant men. Try a middle on. Small like a mirror as a damn earthquake. And make big business happy anytime, anywhere. That you just get happy. Come on, Blade! Come on, Blade! Come on, Blade! Blade!
Yep, it's just as relevant now, more so even. And, you know, like DOA did with Fucked Up Ronnie, I feel like you could just change the R to a D and the lyric would be just as relevant. And, you know, the idea about the U.S. forking out their tongue at human rights, maybe paying lip service to it, although these days not even, you know, they're withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Commission and essentially, like, you know, the Republican Party has for years, like, you know, encouraged, like, the reinstitution of enhanced interrogation tactics, which is to say torture, and the idea of cozying up to unsavory characters, dubious bedfellows in politics, which is to say leaders like Bukele down in El Salvador, as long as, you know, they, you know, allow American companies to do what they will down there and to make more money. So the idea of, again, making dubious political alliances and oppressing a great many people abroad and domestically who dare to say anything against it. Yeah, it feels all too pertinent and poignant. So yeah, again, it's hard when, punk rock songs tend, at least like muckraking, anarcho-punk, where they're, critiquing politics and society and culture. It's hard for those kind of songs to stay specifically relevant because often they're addressing very specific things, and, governments change, regimes change, like the character of like geopolitics can even change, even as, human nature and the avarice and greed and propensity for violence of human nature, remains the same. Again, it's just hard for songs like that to stay especially relevant. Whereas if you write a song about like, the complicated feelings of being in love or whatever, by and large, that song 100 years from now will probably still resonate because it speaks to aspects of our psycho-emotional experience which are more or less like hardwired into our DNA and then expressed through our, cognitive experience and our socialization and so on. So it's easier for a song like that to stay relevant over the decades and beyond, but it's amazing to me how songs by Bad Religion, Dead Kennedys, Subhumans that were written in the early 80s seem as relevant, if not more so now, 40 plus years later. So yeah, it's a testament to the insight and, I guess, unfortunately, to the recurrent themes of history, even as the, character of geopolitics and so on evolves, shifts, and changes over time. So yeah, it's a well-written song. It's a brutal song, again, talking about political disappearances and torture and, disappearing murderers and the enforcement of some regime in a totalitarian, authoritarian way with assistance from a nation state that even, publicly, or not that even, that publicly is proclaiming its commitment to human rights and its democratic values and so on, when, again, behind the scenes and sometimes, right out in the open, they're doing anything but that. So, again, I'll get off the soapbox, and as I always say, I'm open to different interpretations. Lots of consonants and syllables in that phrase, as well as, people who have different points of view. It's all good. To me, that's what being punk is about, is, having a pluralistic approach to issues and not being dogmatic, which of course the Dead Kennedys would address directly in their song Where Do You Draw the Line? So yes, ultimately it's all good if you don't quite see the lyrics or these concepts the same as me, but when I do punk reactions, I talk about these songs. I've thought about these songs for many, many years. I mentioned it before, I got into punk rock in the early 90s, and a lot of the bands I got into were bands that had really kind of made their name a decade or more earlier. So I've been listening to this album since the mid-90s, since like 94, 95, so yeah, ultimately I have thought about it quite a bit over the last 30 years. In any case, let me know what you think, and I will see you for the next one. Peace.